This meeting we're having this evening is to track the climate crimes of hydraulic fracking for natural gas in northern BC, to the tar sands and back to BC through the pipelines, and then through via our coastal waters out to the US and China. We're tracking it all the way around. The meeting has been organized by the Council of Canadians Vancouver Burnaby chapter and by Occupy Vancouver, the environmental justice group of that. And Sema and I are going to be co-chairing the meeting. So good evening and thank you for coming.
And I would just like to recognize that we are on unceded Coast Salish territory.
So starting off, I'd like to tell you about our three panelists. They're all deeply committed and actively working on these issues. Ben Parfitt, to my left, will speak on fracking and its connection with the tar sands. Tria Donaldson will speak on the pipelines and coastal water issues. And Eric Doherty on system change, not climate change. I will call on Ben first. Many of you will know of his writings on forestry issues and more recently on fracking. He's a resource policy analyst with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and has written 2 reports on this topic that I know of, one in October 2010 and one last year, November 2011. He has many awards for his investigative journalism also on environmental issues. So Ben Parfitt, please.
Thank you very much for your kind words and for the opportunity to be here. I think it was about a year ago that I spoke at a similar gathering organized by the council, and I apologize for some of you in the room that may have been there for that first one, because I will cover a bit of ground that overlaps with that earlier presentation. But I'm here tonight to talk to you a bit about what's going on in the northeast of the province, where shale gas developments are well underway, and talk to you a bit about the implications for our water resources, our hydroelectric resources, and our climate as these developments move ahead. And I'm really glad to be on a panel tonight, because I think I'm going to be presenting a lot of bad news, and I think at the tail end of it there's going to be some hope. Not to put too much pressure on you, Eric, but there's going to be more hope at the end. Although I am going to end my presentation by talking about some fundamental changes that we could make in policies now that would have a significant bearing on what the future of this province looks like and would affect it in a positive way. So I'll end on a bit of a positive note. So I want to talk to you a bit about fracking and some of the implications for our water and hydro resources, and how the fracking industry, or the natural gas industry more particularly, links in with the tar sands and with Enbridge. So I'm hoping I've got this.
Just left click.
Just left click it. No, sorry. Okay, so first off, I want to explain a little bit about the pipelines, water, climate, and energy connections and what's at stake. Okay, so the first point, we are currently witnessing in British Columbia the most water-intensive and energy-intensive natural gas production on Earth. And I'll explain a little bit more later why that's the case. We have seen, while everyone here is very concerned about the proposed Enbridge pipelines and the proposed expansion of the Keystone XL lines, we have an approved pipeline that would carry liquid gas to the west coast of the province, Kitimat, where that gas would be liquefied using a supercooling technique where you supercool gas to the point where it turns into liquid, and then it would be loaded on tankers down for the other side of the Pacific Ocean in the markets of China, Korea, Japan, etc. We also have, if this is all built out, major implications moving forward for our water and hydro resources, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And then it's very important to understand in the context of what I'm talking about that Enbridge is not just a pipeline designed to move bitumen from the tar sands in Alberta to the west coast for exportation. This is a two-way, two-conduit pipeline proposal that will carry tar sands oil out and bring condensate in, natural gas condensate. Condensate is a liquid that is produced in the natural gas process, and condensate is needed to facilitate the movement of bitumen through the pipelines. So we actually need to get condensate into Alberta in order to move the bitumen out. So all of these things are happening together or may soon happen, and it's that backdrop that I need you to think about. And I want you to think, as I'm talking through my presentation, that at every stage of the game here, we are talking about producing the most gas using the most water-intensive and energy-intensive methods on Earth today to, in many cases, facilitate the most water-intensive and energy-intensive oil production on Earth today. The largest amount of our natural gas currently produced in British Columbia goes to Alberta, and we all know who the biggest consumer of natural gas is in Alberta. And what they do with our natural gas in Alberta's tar sands is use it to heat water to create steam, which is essential to separate the bitumen from the sand that it is bound up in. So I want to just give you a quick overview of where the major shale gas zones are in North America. Shale gas has become the game changer, if you will, to use that overused phrase, as far as natural gas production in North America and increasingly around the globe is concerned. So you'll see on this map here that we have many zones of shale gas. The most important one to begin with is the one in the south called the Barnett Shale in Texas, and that's really where the revolution in shale gas production began. And as you'll see, there are many different shale gas zones, including two in British Columbia, one in the far northeast of the province called the Horn River Basin, which is generally in the Fort Nelson area, and then to the south, the Montney, which will take in the communities of Fort St. John, Dawson Creek, Chetland. So this gives you a little bit of a schematic of the northeast of the province. And I think it's important to understand, because most of us unfortunately never get further north than about Whistler. But we live in a very big province, an extremely big province. The northeast of British Columbia is larger than all but 14 of the states south of the 49th parallel. It's slightly larger than the state of Nebraska. It's slightly smaller than the state of Kansas. It has a population of about 60,000 people. Okay, so this is a vast area. If you want to get to the heart of the northernmost of the fracking zones, you're going to be in a car for 2 days from Vancouver. Okay, it's a long, long ways away. It's out of sight, out of mind for most of us. So what I'm talking about here is this area going up, and most of the pictures that I'm going to be showing you are just outside of Hudson's Hope. If you can read that, it's up there a little ways. It's right at the end of the largest freshwater body in British Columbia, which is actually an artificial body, which is really important because it's got some of the largest dams in the world, damming the Peace River and flooding the Peace, Finlay, and Parsnip valleys, and that's Williston Lake. So I want to just give you a flavor for what I saw in this area when I was up there 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. There's a guy named Bob Webster. This is his farmland. He's raises buffalo on this land. Just behind the height of land, where all that land is cleared, on the other side of the height of land is the Williston Reservoir, which I talked about just a minute ago. And 20 years ago, when Bob and his wife moved into this area, this was Crown land. They obtained a lease to it, but in order to gain rights to that land under an agricultural lease, they had to clear it all. So Bob was working as an electrician by day, and he was getting on a bulldozer at night, and he was pushing over trees to make way for all of this land here. When I was up there in September 2010, this was one of the worst years for drought in almost a century. So fracking, for those of you that don't know anything about it, is basically what's called a stimulation technique in industry terms. It's a way of stimulating gas production. And in order to do that, what you do is you drill way down into the earth. In the case of British Columbia, you're going down about 2 kilometers, right, until you hit this shale zone. And then what you do is you drill out in very, very long horizontal reaches that may be 2 kilometers in length as well, through this desired seam that you want to exploit. And then you start pressure pumping water at extreme pressure. And when I say extreme pressure, I'm looking into right now 3 clusters of earthquakes. Earthquakes day in and day out for 8 days in a row in pretty much exactly the same location that are occurring remarkably close to where some of the world's largest fracking operations are now occurring. So we're talking about pressure pumping water at 5,000 pounds per square inch down a very, very narrow well bore with so much force that when the water gets to the desired point, it actually breaks the rock up. And it is the fracturing or the fracking of that rock which allows pathways in the rock to open up, which allows the gas to be released. So basically what we're doing is we're using controlled, as in the industry puts it, controlled brute force to unlock the gas that is trapped in these tightly bound formations. That's what fracking is all about. So I want to just quickly run through some pictures to give you some sense of this locale. This is a shot of Williston Reservoir, a small little bay, probably 20 minutes drive from Bob Webster's farm. And when I was down there, this is what the sign was at the end of the road terminating at Williston Reservoir. It's a sign notifying the viewer that they're at Talisman Energy's water withdrawal site. And 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there were water trucks pulling up to this site and dozens of other sites in the area, pulling water out of reservoirs, lakes, rivers, and streams. Imagine the energy required to then move that water. So this water truck here has pulled water out of the Peace River down in the background there, and it's about probably a third of the way up this hill to get onto the bench where Bob's farm is. Then these trucks drive down these huge roads that have been cut through the aspen and spruce forest to deliver water to staging pits. To give you some perspective on the size of this pit, that pit will hold, when filled, about 10 Olympic swimming pools worth of water. It's a lot of water. And when I was up there, driving along this area, there was a pit every kilometer or so. This is a shot of a pit near a well site that is actively being developed for fracking. So to situate you, you've got a water truck that is offloading water. You've got flare stacks in the background that are flaring off gas that's being produced prior to production taking place. And then the big tower that you see off to this side is a tower that is being used to sink a well for eventual fracking. This is an aerial view of a well site. Typically you have numerous wells located on these well pads. You'll see 2 circular ponds. Those ponds are for wastewater. You'll see the large body of water, again about 10 Olympic swimming pools worth of water. And you'll see a lot of trucks. All of those trucks have diesel compressors on the back of them, and it's those compressors which are hooked up to hose which allow for the water as well as sand and chemicals to be pushed underground in the stimulation process. This gives you an idea about the size of the wastewater pits or containment ponds, but it's really only a fraction of the wastewater that's produced, because you've got to remember that all of this water that is pumped underground, most of it comes back. And when it comes back, it's going to be contaminated with all the sand and the chemicals that were used in the fracking process, as well as anything that it's come into contact with underground. So you can pump fresh water down the hole, and you can end up, because of the minerals in the rock formations underground, with water that is 5 times saltier than ocean water when it comes back. This is highly contaminated water. And that highly contaminated water builds up and up and up in volume to the point where you need to put it in even bigger pits to store it. Now, the good news is that companies like Talisman are doing quite a good job of capturing and reusing this water. But at some point, the water becomes so contaminated that they have to start mixing it with more fresh water to dilute it. Otherwise, it fracks up, the fracking process, if you guys get what I mean. And eventually, even that water becomes so contaminated that some of it has to be permanently disposed by deep well injection. In other words, they take the water, they pressure pump it way, way down underground where presumably it stays forever and causes us no more work. Okay, so I want to just give you a bit of an idea about some of the implications for our water resources, our water-derived hydroelectric resources, and our greenhouse gas emissions strategy if we embrace fully developing our natural gas resources, as our Premier, Christy Clark, and Energy Minister, Rich Coleman, recently announced that they fully intend to do. So fracking. Now I've given you just a flavor for the thirst for water of this industry, but let's talk a little bit more about that. I call this the big gulp. In British Columbia today, global fracking industry records are being set for water usage. At one multi-well pad in the Horn River Basin last year, 600 Olympic swimming pools worth of water were pressure pumped at just one multi-well site. There will be thousands of such well sites developed if the industry is able to develop out the way that it wants to. We've got very, very poor information being collected by our regulators on how much water is being used, where it's being withdrawn, and how it's being disposed. And although we're starting to see some positive moves on the part of the energy industry regulator, the Oil and Gas Commission, to start to share some of this information, I can tell you, because I've been looking at it a lot over the last 2 years, the information that we do have to date is very, very poor. And what the Oil and Gas Commission is presenting to the public is only a fraction of all of the water that is being used. There's also, though, going to be implications for our water-derived hydropower. I want to talk a bit about that. And by the way, a lot of this research that I'm doing now and I'm going to be moving forward with is being done in a partnership research initiative with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and the POLIS Project on Ecological Governance at the University of Victoria. And we're looking very closely now, and will be for some time to come, at what we call the water-energy nexus. So water is critical to produce power. And conversely, energy is critical to produce the water services that we all take for granted. So the pumping of water, the moving about of water, the treatment of water, the treatment of wastewater, all of that requires energy. So these two things, water and energy, are inextricably linked. And policy wonks call this the energy-water or water-energy nexus. But it's a very, very interesting line of study. And for obvious reasons, people are paying more attention to it now because our populations are increasing. Demands for water are escalating from new and emerging sectors like the fracking industry. So we need to be cognizant of what the implications for our water and hydro resources are moving forward with industries like this. So this is a shot of the Williston Reservoir. It is one of the largest earth-filled reservoirs on Earth. The height of that reservoir is taller than all but one of the skyscrapers in Vancouver, okay? That curving edifice there is about 2.5 kilometers long. If you could see the base of it, most of which is underwater, the base of it is 1 kilometer across. So this is a massive pyramid, curving pyramid, constructed in the 1960s. It took 1 million dump trucks worth of glacial till to build this edifice. And the water that is now impounded by it is, this makes it the 7th largest reservoir on Earth by water volume. How much water is impounded by that reservoir? 70 cubic kilometers of water. Now, 70 cubic kilometers of water is, it's so vast, it's almost beyond comprehension. But if you took the entire Greater Vancouver Regional District, the 3rd largest metropolitan region in Canada and buried it under 25 meters of water. That's how much water is in this reservoir. And every...
That sounds
I want that ringtone, that's
Set it off to acting.
so the reason I talk about all that water is that we need to understand that in this room right now, most of the lights would not be on were it not for that water. Okay? Every 2 years, 70 cubic kilometers of water impounded by that dam is run through the turbines at that dam's powerhouse. And that is providing a 1/20th, or 1/5, I should say, of all the power produced in British Columbia. It's coming from that one dam. Okay? So I say all of that by way of saying that there are consequences as we move forward with fossil fuel production in this province, because not only is the fossil fuel industry going to need water, it's going to need power. And very significantly, to underscore the tension on this front, those pictures I showed you earlier of Talisman's water takings, well, they're coming out of that reservoir, right? And these are early days for fracking in British Columbia. So the prospect is real that we're going to see more and more water being withdrawn from our most important hydroelectric reservoir, and the industry is going to need more hydroelectric power as well to power up its needs. So there's a major expansion underway of transmission line infrastructure in British Columbia. There are two significant proposals, one which is already past the proposal stage and is being built in the northwest of the province, that is going to carry the power grid into the Sacred Headwaters area for proposed mining expansion. And then in the northeast of the province, which I've been talking about, there's a project that could top out at a couple of $2 billion to extend the transmission infrastructure 500 kilometers from from Fort St. John to Fort Nelson to facilitate gas industry development. So I mentioned before the WAC Bennett Dam, largest hydro dam in the province, 7th largest reservoir in the world, impounds 70 cubic kilometers of water. Below the Bennett Dam is the existing Peace Canyon Dam, about 20 kilometers below the WAC Bennett Dam. Interesting in this picture, if you look at it, you've got the dam there in the foreground, you've got all that beautiful aspen forest, and then in the background, there's some wind turbines, which of course are the gross exception to the rule in British Columbia. Most of our power comes from traditional hydroelectric sources. So the big question for people living up in this region is, are we going to get a third dam on the Peace River? It's a good question. We may well. If we do, it'll be 80 kilometers downstream from Site C. It'll flood about 4,000 hectares of prime agricultural land. And a lot of the power that is produced at that dam will be used by the fracking industry. So if you start to look at the power demands moving forward, the shale gas industry, if it builds the one liquefied natural gas terminal at Kitimat that has been approved, and the pipeline for which has also been approved, that one facility will take 8% of all of the power that is currently produced on our hydroelectric grid. The Premier and the Energy Minister have stated as a goal having 3 such facilities in the province by 2020, and that translates into a quarter of all of the hydroelectric power that is produced in the province by an industry that will also be consuming more and more of our water, and by an industry that is moving much of its current output to Alberta to facilitate that very water-intensive and energy-intensive oil. Fracking with our climate. We are fracking with our climate when we do this stuff. Do not accept industry and government assertions that this is a clean energy source that is vital to transitioning to the low-carbon economy that we all want. Many emerging studies suggest that the emissions associated with the shale gas industry, when all is said and done, are going to put it on an equivalency with coal. Okay? If the industry develops out the way that the Pembina Institute believes it will, and the way that respected energy economist Mark Chickard believes it will, we're looking at a doubling of GHG emissions in this sector over the next few years. Why is that going to happen? Well, in some of these gas zones in British Columbia, particularly the Horn River Basin, that gas up there is extremely high in CO2 content. Earlier proposals by Enbridge, by Encana, was that they were going to get into carbon capture and storage. They've abandoned those plans because it's too expensive. The end result is that we've got a gas that is very high in CO2 content. Unless that CO2 is captured and somehow stored, it's going to be vented to the atmosphere. It's going to be disproportionately more harmful to our environment than other forms of gas. Okay, and there's a couple of other things I want to talk about very quickly. We have an interesting problem in British Columbia as it relates to our gas, and this is actually a problem that pertains to every jurisdiction that's producing gas in North America right now, which is that the price for natural gas is incredibly low. Most people that are producing gas right now are making money, if they're making money at all, just marginal amounts. The problem is we put a lot of infrastructure in place to produce this gas. We're running out of storage capacity. The only way that companies are really making money right now on gas production in BC is producing wet gas. And wet gas is gas that is high in that condensate that I mentioned earlier. And that condensate is valuable enough that they can make money. That condensate then gets moved over to Alberta. There is a potential, and I'm looking into this, but there's a potential that we could see more gas flaring because there's really no market for gas, but there is for condensate. So we flare off the gas and we move the condensate over to Alberta because that's where the money is. I'm researching that right now. I can't state definitively that that is the case, but I believe it could be. So there are further climatic implications for developing the resource at this time because the resource is so low in value right now. So looking ahead, one of the things I asked myself in doing most recent research for the CCBA, which by the way is up on our website, please go there if you haven't seen the report. It's called Fracking Up Our Water. There's copies at the back. Grab a copy at the back. Thank you. But when I was developing that report, I asked myself a question, if I was in Bob Simpson's shoes and I was living up in the middle of this thing, dealing with all of this stuff, what are some of the things that I think he and others would like to see? And it's on that note that I want to end. There are policy options, but we really need governments to embrace the fact that the resource that we're talking about here, while it may deliver funds to provincial coffers, is a non-renewable resource which has a shelf life. So what I have proposed and what we're going to be doing more work on at the CCBA moving forward is the idea that we need to place a cap on just how much of this gas we're producing. I mean, we live in a province that has a long, rich history of working with forest resources and fisheries resources. We may all have arguments about how sustainably we've been managing those resources, but they are renewable resources if they're managed properly. So if we're placing caps on how much forest can be logged and caps on how many fish can be taken out of the water, why aren't we placing caps on a non-renewable resource? So if we were to cap this, then we could begin to approach having something called rational resource development, which is where I think we need to get. We need to establish firm no-go zones where the industry simply cannot operate because there are other values that are just too great and could be ruined by this development. We need a single assigning authority for water resources. Right now we have 2. We need 1. We need increased pricing of water and hydro resources, which will act to conserve those resources. And I make that recommendation having read the report of the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy, which the Harper government has had the good sense to disband. They're talking about the need to move into water pricing to ensure better conservation of our water resources. And finally, we need complete, full, honest, transparent accounting of how many greenhouse gases are actually associated with this industry's activities. I believe we're not getting a true accounting of that right now, and I think if the public had a real understanding of what the true emissions were that were associated with this industry, that they would be saying that this should be priority number one for our development. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tria.
Thank you very much.